afraid it's useless for me to ask, can you hear me at the back? But I do hope that you can both hear me and see me. I wish I could be with you. I was recently asked in the Society of Indexer survey, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to someone starting out as an indexer? I've replied, as it's now nearly 50 years since I started, it's an entirely different world. I wouldn't presume to offer advice to a beginner today. I will tell you of indexing as it was practiced when I took up the craft myself, of the development of the Society of Indexers from that time, and the editing of the Indexer from the 70s to the 90s. I joined the Society myself in its 7th year, 1965, in a scene nearly as different from today socially as it was technically. I had left university in 1957 with 3 black marks against me for the employment market. I was a woman, an arts graduate, and married. No employer wanted such a creature. My husband attracted some admiration even for condoning my search for work. It was not accepted on all sides at that time that wives might take work outside the home. Eventually I did find a job as a proofreader in a printing press, one that was producing scholarly editions of the works of Pope and Shakespeare, but quickly lost it again, as the Printers' Union restricted the work to males who had served a 7-year apprenticeship, which I was not and had not. I took a series of odd jobs, eventually being accepted as a teacher, untrained. I then gave up outside work to produce and bring up my children. When my first son started attending nursery school in 1964, and his younger brother slept at that time, giving me some precious hours to myself, I began to feel the need for some form of skilled work that I could do at home, both financially and to preserve some sort of grip on sanity and the world outside. I saw reports in the papers of the agencies which were being set up then to provide part-time work at home for women in my position, such as AFEM, A-F-E-M, Agency for the Employment of Mothers Limited. The types of work they offered included indexing. To a compulsive list maker, crossword puzzle addict, and tracer of single themes through literary works, this seemed tailor-made for me. The Society of Indexers was founded in 1957, after Guildford Norman Knight, a former barrister and civil servant who had been a freelance solitary indexer for the previous 30 years, wrote to the Times Literary Supplement suggesting the formation of such a society. Replies came in. Knight invited the writers to luncheon at his London club, and the Society of Indexers, which I will henceforth refer to as SI, was inaugurated 15 months later at a meeting held at the National Book League, with 134 individual members and 23 institutional. It was hailed by a leading article in the Times, celebrating the newly formed Society of Indexers. In March, the first issue of the Indexer appeared, 1958, boasting a page-long message from the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. I wrote to SI to ask how to start being an indexer and received a helpful letter from the then Secretary, Alan Baker. He told me there is no formal training for indexing work, recommending that beginners should read 4 books: Gordon Carey's Making an Index, the British Standard 377 1964, Recommendations for the Preparation of Indexes, and 2 by Robert Collison, Indexes and Indexing, and Indexing Books. About fees, he wrote, "Fees for indexing are very difficult to fix because there are so many variables. As a rough guide, we recommend payment by the hour. For a light work requiring no more than an index of names, you recommend a minimum of 10 shillings per hour. That's 50p today. For works of semi-scholarship requiring an index of names and concepts, 12 and 6pence per hour. And for works of scholarship requiring specialist knowledge, 15 shillings. That's 75p per hour. I studied the 4 books and sent off letters to publishers seeking commissions. My pleas were luckily successful, and I was asked to index a biography of the first woman doctor in England. It was necessary to provide myself with the tools of my new trade. This was, of course, long before the advent of personal computers. Indexers mostly worked on cards, mostly 5 by 3 inch, writing an entry on a card and arranging them in alphabetical order in wooden or metal trays that were nicknamed shoe boxes. A historical artifact, an a shoebox index tray. They were nicknamed shoe boxes, or indeed you could use actual shoe boxes, which would serve the purpose well for as long as they lasted. I obtained cards by the hundreds, cut for me by printers. Indexers would also buy tabbed cards to to mark the alphabetical division of the set of cards in the tray. And I used coloured cards for specific categories of entry, say blue for major entries, yellow for place names, green for book or journal titles. For economy, cards were reused. When a job was finished, the entries on the cards no longer needed for reference. A regular chore was to cross through the entries on the cards and turn them for reuse. For brief entries, the same cards could be used for 4 indexes, both sides, both ways up. Sets of index cards usually needed to be typed out on paper to send to the printer. Then typing was done noisily on manually operated typewriters with an inked ribbon running along the top for the metal letters to hit. When the ribbon was worn out, a new one had to be inserted, an intricate and messy procedure. If extra copies were needed, sheets of carbon paper had to be placed between the pages of typing paper. Tiny, flimsy pieces of special paper had to be placed above errors to type over again to correct them, on each copy separately. Then Tipp-Ex came on the market, little bottles of opaque white fluid that you painted over typing errors. Eventually, electric typewriters made typing easier and faster, and at last the photocopier offered an alternative to the use of carbon paper. To get photocopies, I had to find out which local shops or offices provided this service, and take my original there, paying 10p or 12p per sheet. Even typing seemed advanced technology. Looking through old files to prepare this talk, I was surprised and frustrated to find out how many letters from society officers were handwritten. I worked exhaustively on that first index and sent the extremely over-detailed result to the author, who wrote to me, "I have checked through the index and it seems to me admirable. If you want at any time to give my name as a reference to publishers or authors, please do." Triumphantly, I sent off applications for work citing this reference and indeed obtained further commissions. But 11 days after the author's letter, I received another from the publishers, quite different in tone. "We had it cast off by the printer. It makes 20 pages of 2 columns, small print. This is far too much. It is much too detailed for any likely reader or consultant of the book." The book was published with a 10-page index, not reduced by me. Perhaps this illustrates 2 received truths about indexing: that novice indexers tend to over-index, and that authors may regard no detail of their work as too insignificant to be indexed. I was then able, though, to write to the women's homework agencies saying that I had had an index published and received work from these sources, with the agencies taking their commission from the pay. I also obtained work through the Society of Indexers panel that recommended indexes to publishers. Indexing at home with small children did, of course, have its own problems. Not fiddling with mummy's cards was their major taboo, especially after one child was found about to extract all the pink ones from a set ready for typing. They had their own indexes, old cards of mine in shoe boxes, which they removed, scribbled on, and replaced as to the manner born, which indeed they were. The 2-year-old made a great impression at the infant clinic, looking at a tray of record cards and lisping, "Is that the lady's index?" At that time there were many women so placed. Indexing was in part a cottage industry, its freelance practitioners, predominantly female, working at home. Even the words pin money were sometimes heard. When my youngest child started school in 1973, I had compiled 88 indexes, and found the work and its circumstances so congenial that I did not return to full-time teaching as planned, but remained a home-based freelance indexer. I came to prefer and to list as my subject specialisms humanities, narrative texts, biographies and histories which treat of people, their experience and relationships. I call these soft texts, as distinct from the dry, documentary texts of science, technology and medicine, which are composed of discrete, that's ending with ETE, units, and usually have standardized terminology and established formal structure. I particularly enjoyed the devising of subtle subheadings for individual situations in soft texts, which, as Hans Wellisch wrote, provide an opportunity for the indexer to be creative in paraphrasing the text, supplying terms that express the context concisely and precisely, and match the tenor of the text. A disadvantage of indexing personal text is that it can lead to feelings of guilt at invading privacy or causing distress. Indexing a history of the World War II resistance movement based on newly accessed records, I was horribly aware that the relatives of Gestapo victims might learn here for the first time the exact awful details of their fates. Indexing the love letters of a mystic poet, intended for no third eye, let alone publication, made me feel a most intrusive voyeur, as I sought to reduce outpourings of spiritual ecstasy to precise terms. That index, though, did bring about a memorable sequel. I was invited to the press launch of the book and introduced to the editor, a florid Lebanese. He bowed low and profusely kissed my hand as he said, "For your beautiful index." The development of the Society of Indexers did not tally with its august origins, London clubs, National Book Lead, Times Leader, letter from the Prime Minister. It was small and voluntary. It had no premises. Meetings were held in London, usually as guests of the Library Association, or for small committees in members' houses. I lived 20 miles north of London and could attend the meetings. In 1976, I was appointed a member of the Board of Assessors that considered whether indexes submitted by members showed them to be worthy of registration. Thus, I first got to know those stalwart personalities, the indefatigable and ebullient John Gordon, the vigorous and forthright Elizabeth Wallace, and surely the world's most fanatic, dogmatic proofreader, Neil Fiske. This is a photocopy of a page proof for the Indexer, corrected and returned by Neil. Communication between meetings was only by post or telephone. We had to watch expenses carefully and try to make long-distance calls only in off-peak periods, that is, out of office hours, when the home-based are trying to lead their home lives, their working papers put away. Publications relevant for many of us to read had to be passed on from reader to reader by post, expensively, with about a week between each name on the circulation list. 1978, the 21st year of SI, was cataclysmic, both for the Society and for my own involvement with it. First, Leonard Montague Harrod, who had been editor of the Indexer for 14 years, suddenly resigned because of family circumstances. At the same time, his deputy editor, Mary Piggott, had sustained head injuries in a traffic accident and could not take over the journal. A new editor was needed. A call for nominations went out, accompanied by a list of requirements for the post, and I volunteered. My only editorial experience was with our local Consumer Groups magazine and the newsletter of National Housewives Register, both voluntary posts, but I found that I loved editing, assembling the parts, tailoring them, and arranging them to form a coherent whole, and eagerly seized the opportunity. So far as I know, there was no other candidate. I was elected Indexer editor in May 1978, which meant that I also became a member of SI's council. My predecessor as editor had given me 5 sheets of instructions, couched in spidery handwriting, so difficult to read that they could not be referred to for quick guidance. To know how long an article might prove in print, I had to cast off by counting the characters in each of 10 lines and multiplying the average by the estimated number of lines in the typescript. Make-up was done by cutting out the galley proofs with scissors and pasting them with cowl gum onto page grids. In July 1978, the SI held its first international conference in Roehampton, South London, where I met Norman Knight, then in a wheelchair, as well as 2 speakers who were to become, in my view, the greatest contributors the Indexer has had, William Heckscher and Hans Willich, born respectively in Germany and Austria before the rise of the Nazi Party, and both by then residents of the United States. The conference was also attended by representatives from the American Society of Indexers, which had affiliated to SI in 1972, that was Dorothy Thomas, from the Australian Society, which affiliated in 1977 and was represented by Jean Hacker, and the Indexing and Abstracting Society of Canada, represented by Peter Grieg, who all read congratulatory messages on SI's coming of age. Peter Grieg had several meetings with SI officers, and the affiliation of the Canadian Society to SI was settled during that conference. Volume 11, number 2 of the Indexer, the first issue under my editorship, was due for publication in October, and had the proceedings of this conference to prepare and include. The paper given by Hans Willich, Early Multilingual and Multiscript Indexes in Herbals, ran to 22 pages, including 10 illustrations, each with a caption, 21 footnotes, and 45 references with superscripts. I had never laid out anything so complicated, and indeed hadn't since. The instructions my predecessor as editor had given me did not cover my particular problem, editing a journal from a house with no spare room and with 3 children. I was able to devote attention to the journal only during the hours when the children were at school. I would spread typescripts, proofs, typewriter and tools over the dining table, clearing everything away as tea time approached. The journal production schedule was changed to avoid the busiest period coinciding with school holidays. The children tried to help, knowing they must not touch my papers or make noise during my phone calls, and doing their best to deal with these themselves when necessary. I came home once to find that my young daughter had taken a booking for an advertisement for a thesaurus, helpfully ascertaining and noting down for me, "It's a sort of book." Then, just as we finally went to press with the Indexer issue, including the conference proceedings, Norman Knight, SI founder president, died. So after all the trauma of getting my first issue into print, my next, volume 11, number 3, had to include an obituary and tributes for Knight. And we had to redesign the journal cover to take in the affiliation of the Canadian Society. In 1979, SI joined the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers, a body composed of the publishing arms of learned societies and professional institutions. We were members of Group A, the smallest category, those societies spending less than $10,000 a year on publication. SI was one of the few members that had no premises. Fellow institutional representatives asking where I was based, being told, "at home," would look politely surprised. Also in that year, our London-based treasurer resigned and was succeeded by one in Cambridge, where our secretary lived. I asked for the new treasurer's telephone number to be told, "The treasurer does not have a telephone, but the secretary has a bicycle." Then on to number 4 of my first Indexer volume, which had always included the volume index, prepared each year by a different member of SI. I was well aware that this commission might not be the honour it appeared. My predecessor as editor had once telephoned me and asked me to prepare the index to the current volume. I gasped, overwhelmed, "I think you ought to ask someone else." With a remarkable lack of tact, he told me, "I've already asked everyone else." I declined the commission. Now it was up to me to find a volume index and get his or her work into print in the final issue of the volume. It was over the indexing of each volume of the Indexer that I came thoroughly to understand and even empathise with publishers' impatience with indexes. So on to 1980, my second Indexer volume, when the printers of the Indexer suffered a union go-slow. Then in 1981, we were again faced with provision of a volume index. John Gordon later wrote a splendid article on the variations of the Indexer indexes, including, "For just over 2 decades, it was editorial policy to give each volume indexer extensive freedom to display his or her personal virtuosity. Each compilation has its own special qualities, revealing fascinating variations of style, of technique, of decision-making. It has indeed been said with pride that these indexes are living proof that indexing is an art rather than a science. Truly, they demonstrate how widely individual indexes may vary in the solution of particular problems, and how numerous such primitive variables are." Not helpful, though, for standardization and trying to accumulate the indexes. Before commissioning the index for Volume 12, the editorial board sent a list of 40 questions about index style to 8 prominent SI members, and collated the far from uniform replies to form a set of guidelines for index of indexes, which he hoped would eventually enable a cumulative index to be compiled. Frida Wilkinson, who undertook to prepare the index to Volume 12, was the Society's treasurer, and she made calculations as to the likely cost of providing a cumulative index, concluding as treasurer that it would simply not be possible for the Society to meet it. She agreed that she would keep a record of her hours compiling the index for Volume 12 and charge SI's recommended indexing rate for it. But after completing the work, she said the hours were excessive and innumerable, and accepted from herself as treasurer only a small token payment. The editorial board subsequently battled valiantly to adopt the principle that the Society should not exploit the professional skills of its members by underpaying them for indexing commissions, and should pay the full hourly rate for these, although not doing so for any other type of work undertaken on behalf of the Society. but in fact never, in my time on council at least, was it able to put its money where its mouth was and do so. Our indexes all received only token inadequate payments. By 1983 also, the 3 affiliated societies, as well as SI, each had their own newsletter, carrying their own national indexing news. The indexer began to concentrate less on the development of the societies, reporting these in a new, regular feature, Shoebox International, in which Judy Batchelor, the indexer's wittiest contributor, provided elegant, detailed, appreciative resumes of all 4 societies' newsletters. Meanwhile, technology had developed with bewildering speed. Computers had made their first appearance in the Indexer in 1965, with a description of their use of the production of technical manuals at IBM. In 1981, the year I moved on to use an electric typewriter, the journal expatiated on the difference between microcomputers, described as complete computer systems, and microprocessors, the actual CPU, central processing unit, chips, describing also mainframe computers, mini-computers, dedicated to a particular task, and word processors. Hilary Calvert, a cancer specialist and husband of a freelance indexer, Drusilla, devised a dedicated program to enable her to do her indexing on computer. This was the first indexing software. It was launched as MacRex at a demonstration at the Library Association in 1981, with a discreet advertisement in the Indexer the following year. By 1983, both the journal and the Society's newsletter seemed in danger of being overwhelmed by technical material and discussion among computer users, and a technology working party was formed. It produced the Micro-Indexer, intended to be a technical supplement to the Indexer, hiving off such material from the journal. Its first issue was in January 1983, a single A4 sheet beginning, "This is the first in a series of occasional newsletters which will be devoted to the use of microcomputers by indexers." It ran eventually to 15 issues, finishing in 1992, totaling 152 pages. The most prolific contributors were Drusilla and Hilary Calvert and Richard Raper. There were some disadvantages for indexers in the advent of the computer. Authors thought they could check the indexes provided for them by using the search key. One author complained to the publishers about an index I had prepared, his biography of a playwright. He appears to have called up on his computer screen all occurrences of particular words, printed them out with the lists of page numbers on which they appeared in his typescript, and sent them to the publisher as references the indexer has missed, insisting they be inserted. They included long lists of titles about which nothing was individually stated, casual comparisons, references in the text of plays, an entry for Christ Jesus, with reference to pages where the characters in the plays said, "Oh Christ," and an obscene joke about the Queen, which he considered should be listed under Q for Queen Elizabeth II. Another disadvantage of the advent of the computer for the indexer was social. Being asked by new acquaintances, "What do you do?" and replying, "I'm an indexer," invariably led to, "But haven't computers made indexing obsolete?" I got very tired of delivering the standard riposte, and indeed remain so, as I'm sure you all must be. Computers became prominent in my own life. My husband, a research chemist, became head of the computing department when the institution where he worked acquired first a mainframe, then a network. He went so far as to write an article for the Indexer in 1979, "Computerized indexing need not be impossible." Here he is working on his own computer in the hot summer of 1981. Note the extra appendages needed. On the domestic front, by the 1980s my sons grew up and moved out, and an erstwhile bedroom became my editorial office, boasting file-lined walls, computers and laser printer. My elder son, Ian, bought me a BBC computer for Christmas in 1984. What I most blessed on moving to use it was the silence as I keyed in. When, due to breakdown or power cuts, I had to revert to steam typing, the clatter seemed abominable. The next blessing of computer typing was no longer having to reveal the shame of my horribly messy, heavily corrected typescripts. Then the speed and the ability to print out extra copies, no more shuffling sheets of grubby carbon paper. Formatting was fun too, forming electronic layouts on screen, as I later learned to use and love desktop publishing. Ian was reading maths at university. After graduating in 1985, he spent a year gaining a diploma in computer science for which he had to do a practical project. Having grown up hearing his parents constantly disputing as to whether or not automatic indexing was possible, father said yes, mother no, he chose for his project to write an indexing program for the BBC Micro. Macrex wasn't available for standard BBC Micro. It would be my next Christmas present. However, he decided that no existing computer language was sufficiently sophisticated for his plans, so he began by writing a new language, TILT, T-I-L-T, Threaded Interpretative Language for Text. And the program was to have been LIST, Logical Indexing System in TILT. But alas, the language he devised proved so complex that the wretched examiners gave him his diploma for that, so he never wrote the program. He did, though, devise for me an alphabetical sorting program that I could use with only the word processing facilities of HighView on my BBC Model B. I would type in entries in the form they would appear in print, main heading full out, automatically turned over at maximum line end, subheadings on lines beneath, indented. I would save the complete index with particular symbols at the top and bottom of the section to be sorted, load in the sort program, tell it the name of the file to work on, save the sorted version under a different name, and bless my son. There was a drawback, however. Shortage of memory allowed sorting only of a restricted length of index. Some indexes had to be divided into 2 or even 3 files for separate sorting. In these cases, I had to sort each half or third again into alphabetical halves or thirds, so that the resultant A to H sections could then be combined and resorted together, and the second and third alphabetical sections likewise, before all were again combined in one complete alphabetical file. I might be dealing with 9 separate files, all to be sorted and then combined. Much later, when I had moved from using the BBC computer to a PC and WordPerfect, my husband wrote an indexing program for me to my own specifications as an index of soft texts. He intended to market it as a program for soft indexers, but always there were just a few bugs to clear first. Then he adapted it for Windows, then a few more bugs. Now, 17 years after its genesis, I very much doubt that the market will ever see the program, but I remain extremely happy with it. In 1986, we began what I regard as the most valuable regular feature the indexer has provided. Hans Welisch had published 2 volumes of biography, Indexing and Abstracting, an International Bibliography, reviewed in the indexer as A Comprehensive Survey of Literature on Indexing and Abstracting, and Indexing and Abstracting 1977 to 81. From 1986 to 1989, this current awareness bibliography was resumed in the form of regular instalments he supplied as detachable supplements for the indexer. In 1993, Jean Wheeler undertook the continuation of the bibliography, which concluded with her Part 8 in 1997. In 1988, on behalf of the indexer, I became an investigative journalist. In The Guardian that August, there appeared a letter about the indexing of fiction, signed E. St. J. Arthur, Ivy Cottage, Chat Hill, Northumberland. I recognised it as having appeared in the indexer in 1962, reprinted from the Times, and signed by Evelyn Arthur St. John Waugh, who had since died in 1966. Only one letter of comment appeared in The Guardian, pointing out that this letter was included in a published volume of Waugh's letters and ending, I think you've been had. I traced, got into correspondence with, and named the hoaxer in the pages of the indexer. You can read all about it in volume 16 under the heading, The Strange Affair of the Resurrection of Waugh. I attended and enjoyed all the SI conferences held during my tenure as editor. The one I most remember was in 1989 on an island off the coast of Yugoslavia. I was walking on the mainland with Drusilla Calvert, discussing computer indexing programs, when she remarked, "I helped to build this road." Quite the most unlikely thing you would expect to hear from such a person. She had in fact done this as an undergraduate with an international brigade. In 1990, the fact that ASI installed a society telephone with an answering machine was described as a giant step in communications. In that year, I acquired a fax. By then, the indexer's most enterprising contributors had begun to impress us with formatted printouts and bewilder us by offering discs. I sent out a letter to contributors beginning, "We are going to try supplying copy for our journal to the printers on disc when available in this form," and giving instructions for cooperation with this. At first we passed this straight onto the printers, but later I came to appreciate the advantage of being able to add our own corrections, print out extra copies, count words, no more casting off, or format copy to appear as it would on the printed page. In 1988, SI invested £10,000 in devising and publishing an open learning indexing course of 5 units, each comprising self-study text and self-administered test. It was designed to lead to a new qualification, that of accredited indexer. Its initial units concentrated on the structure and arrangement of indexes, for which it is easy to teach and assess correct practice, rather than analysing concepts and devising terms in which to express them in subheadings. I saw this course as suitable only for documentary indexing, for the indexing of dry texts composed of discrete, ETE again, separate items. It did not cover whole book indexing and gave no guidance for the indexing of soft texts, narratives with extended continuity. I believe that stories of human lives in narrative form bring problems for indexers that are quite distinct from the particular techniques of indexing technical works, with regard both to form and content. I wrote a short book, Indexing Biographies and Other Stories of Human Lives, so that it might complement the SI Open Learning course with advice about indexing soft humanities texts. This was published as the first in SI's series of occasional papers on indexing in 1992, succeeded by a revised and expanded second edition in 1998, and a third in 2004. By 1992, all 4 societies of indexers had greatly expanded and increased their activities, including their output of newsletters. It was no longer possible, even for such a skilled writer as Judy Batchelor, to cover all their contents in single biannual instalments, and Shoebox International was put to rest, replaced by reports supplied by members of each society in a new feature called at first Out of the Shoebox into the Network, then just Network of Indexers. The reporter for Australian affairs was Ian Odgers. We still lacked a cumulative index to the indexer, and I greatly enjoyed compiling a classified list of all our major topics from 1958 to 1993. This showed at a glance how much we had published on particular topics through the 36 years. The largest section was the one devoted to the practice of indexing, which was itself subdivided into sections, the major ones being indexer-author-publisher relations and principles and techniques. The other subsections there were aboutness, alphabetization, bias, evaluation, humour, legal aspects, training and users. The second largest group of contributions was that on subject specialities, 15 of them listed, from archaeology to science and technology. Third came types of indexes, from bibliographic indexing to the indexing of poetry, hymns and psalms, with the indexing of newspapers, periodicals and their accumulations being most numerous. Then, in decreasing order of numbers of articles, biographies and literary figures, countries and languages, information technology application, indexing systems, standards and methods, archives and databases, bibliographies and reference works, the history of indexing, services, and design and layout. The gender balance of contributors also changed through those years. Elizabeth Wallace wrote in the Indexer, reminiscing about the early years of SI, "I remember the overwhelming maleness of the Society's officers." Similarly, all the journal editors up to 1978, when I became editor, had been men. Since then, all have been women. Catherine Sasson has examined articles, editorials, letters to the editor, and reviews from every issue of the Indexer published from 1958 to 2007. She found that women constituted only 11% of all authors in the journal's first 10 years, and 21% in the next 10. The number of women contributors then grew considerably in the years of my editorship. From 1978 to 1987, they constituted 41% of authors, increasing to 49% from 1988 to 1997. In 1995, it was time for me to hand on the Indexer editorship after 18 years in the chair, and bewildered by the seeming technological takeover. I found another disadvantage of the single-person office to be that one small head carries so much journal lore, the only one who knows details of the production routine, process, development, the current state. Recalling the 5 handwritten pages I had been given along with the editorial mantle, I detailed the documentation I thought necessary to represent the production of the journal, set it all down, and passed on many papers and disk files to my successor. Recalling too the solitary state in which I had taken over the journal, I was impressed that the next editor lived in the Isle of Wight, off the south coast of England, with as co-editor a colleague in California, the collaboration made possible by email, which I only took to myself in 1996. From the 37 issues of the Index that I edited, I recall most fondly two misprints that aspired to the state of art. A reference to a ponderously titled German Fund Index appeared in the volume index as Fun Index. And a sentence about early printers included this delightful typo: hushed as the ancient chapels where our monkfish forebears learned the printer's trade. I was also left with familiarity with the index of contents for 18 years, especially the lighter, quirky items that so many people had sent in, discovered in old volumes or noted in the press. I culled a selection of these, edited and annotated them, obtained copyright permissions, and compiled the entertaining anthology, Indexes and Index in Fact and Fiction, published in 2001 by the British Library. I had also made many contributions to the journal myself, and now collated the instalments of the history of societies of indexes that I wrote for it, and some of the features on individual indexes I had interviewed, added to them, and produced the only history of indexes in the market, from flockbait to professionalism. Both of these volumes stem directly from my editing of the Indexer. The publishers who produced flockbaits asked me for a colour picture of an indexer at work for promotion. As the book is a history of indexers, I didn't want a picture of one working on a computer, but I could not find any image of an indexer working with cards. I searched through albums, files, journals, Google images, asked colleagues. I really think no such picture existed. Finally, I decided I would have to fake it. We brought my long unused box tray and supply of index cards and tabs down from the loft, simulated a bunch of Gallipoos by cutting an A4 set in half vertically and taping the sections together into streamers, and my son photographed me at the dining table as in former days, apparently working on them. So I end this talk as I began, describing an indexer at work in the old-fashioned way, with the traditional cards and shoebox, as I practiced it in the 1960s and restaged in the year 2008.